This K9 police dog's unstoppable mission to save his partner will inspire you. When Sergeant Mason is kidnapped, his loyal K9 police dog, Storm, refuses to stand down. Injured but relentless, he tracks his officer through darkness and danger, taking on ruthless criminals with nothing but his instincts and unbreakable loyalty. Time is running out. Can this fearless K9 complete his most important mission before it's too late? Sergeant Mason sat on the old wooden porch of his small house. The wood made a little noise as he leaned back in his chair. The town of Ridgeway was quiet. People here knew each other. They left their doors unlocked. It was the perfect place to live after working for many years as a police officer. His dog, Storm, lay beside him. The German Shepherd was old, but his eyes were sharp. He watched everything around them. His ears moved when he heard sound. Sometimes, he lifted his nose to smell the air. "You never stop working, do you, boy?" Mason said with a smile. He scratched behind Storm's ears, but the dog did not relax. Storm lifted his head and stared at something far away. Mason looked too, but he saw nothing. Just the same trees, sidewalk, and a neighbor's cat lying under a car. "There's nothing there. It's just you and me now," Mason said. But deep inside, he knew Storm was not usually wrong. The dog could feel danger before it arrived. Mason shook his head. He told himself not to worry. There were no criminals here. No late-night chases. No gunfights. Those days were gone. Inside the house, the TV was on. It was showing a crime show. Mason did not pay attention until he heard a name that made his heart beat faster. Authorities say Luis Ortega, the dangerous cartel leader, has escaped from prison. Officials warn that he is very dangerous. Mason froze. He remembered the night they caught Ortega. He could still see the dark warehouse, the way Ortega had stood there with his hands up, smiling. "You think this is over, officer?" Ortega had said. "You have no idea what's coming." Storm had been younger then. He had chased Ortega's men through the city, found hidden drugs, and helped Mason put the cartel leader in jail. It had been a hard fight, but Mason had won. He had never forgotten Ortega's last words. Now Ortega was free. Mason clenched his jaw. Storm let out a low growl. Mason looked at his dog. "It's nothing," he told himself. "We're safe here." He turned the TV down, but his hands were shaking. His heart was still beating fast. That night, Storm was restless. He walked around the house, sniffing the air. He would not lie down. Every few minutes, he let out a low growl. His fur stood up on his back. "Storm," Mason sighed. "You're making me nervous." Storm would not stop staring at the front door. Mason got up and looked out the window. The street was empty. The houses were dark. Everyone was asleep. But then he saw something. A car. It was parked far down the street. It was too far to belong to a neighbor. The lights were off. No one got in or out. Mason's stomach felt tight. Maybe Storm was right to worry. The next morning, Mason stepped outside with his coffee. The car was gone, but something still did not feel right. He had learned to trust his instincts. He looked at Storm. "You still worried, boy?" Storm let out a small whine and pressed against Mason's leg. Mason sighed. He had spent years catching bad men before they could hurt others. But now, something was different. Now, someone was watching him. He put his coffee down and went inside. He locked the door behind him. Storm sat by the door, waiting. The night air was cool as Mason stepped out for his usual walk. The quiet streets of Ridgeway stretched in front of him, empty and peaceful. He pulled his jacket tighter and took a deep breath. Storm walked beside him, his old but strong body moving steadily. The German Shepherd never needed a leash. He stayed close to Mason, always looking around, always ready. Mason tried to forget the bad feeling that had been in his chest since last night. The car that had been outside his house was gone, but he still felt like someone was watching him. He couldn't prove it, but deep inside, he knew something was wrong. They walked past the dim streetlights. Mason was thinking, lost in his own world. Storm was scanning every shadow. Then, suddenly, Storm stopped. His ears stood up. His body became stiff. A low growl came from his throat. Mason frowned. "What is it, boy?" Before he could move, dark figures jumped out from an alley. 3, maybe 4 men. Fast. Silent. Their faces covered with masks. Mason tried to fight back, but strong hands grabbed him, forcing him to the ground. He kicked and twisted, but there were too many of them. A cloth pressed against his face. A sharp, strange smell filled his nose. His vision blurred. His body felt weak. Storm attacked. The old dog was still a fighter. He jumped at the nearest man, his teeth biting deep into his arm. The attacker screamed and stumbled back. Another man swung a metal pipe, hitting Storm hard in the ribs. The dog let out a painful yelp. He fell, but he didn't stay down. He got back up, growling, his teeth bared, ready to fight again. But Mason was already being pulled toward a van. The door slid open, and the men pushed him inside. Storm leaped forward, but another hit landed, this time on his back leg. He collapsed with a small whimper. The van's engine roared. The tires screeched as it sped away. Storm lay on the cold pavement, breathing heavily. His side hurt where the pipe had hit him. His leg throbbed, but the pain didn't matter. Mason was gone. Slowly, Storm got his feet. He sniffed the air. Mason's scent was still there. His tail stiffened. His ears twitched. He had spent years tracking criminals and finding missing people. His body was old, but his instincts were sharp. He would not let Mason down. Back at the house, the phone rang in the silence. A police officer answered, speaking slowly as a frightened neighbor explained what had happened. They took him, right off the street. There were men in masks. And his dog. His dog tried to stop them, but they hit him. They drove off in a dark van. The officer sighed. Sounds like a ransom case. Sergeant Mason has dealt with criminals before, hasn't he? They probably want money. We'll send someone to check it out. But they didn't move quickly. They didn't think it was urgent. To them, it was just another case of a retired cop being kidnapped for money or revenge. They had no idea how dangerous this really was. The dog limped toward the house, each step slow and painful. Blood stuck to his fur where the pipe had hit him. But he didn't stop. He reached the front porch and sniffed deeply. Mason's scent was there, but it was fading. Storm didn't need help. He had spent his whole life working with Mason, learning from him, watching him solve cases. Now, Mason needed him. Ignoring his injuries, Storm picked up the scent. His paws moved forward, his nose close to the ground. He would not rest. He would not stop. He was slow because of the pain in his leg and side, but he did not stop. Mason needed him. His paws pressed against the dirt road, leaving light tracks behind. The night was dark and cold, but Storm kept going. He had only one goal: find Mason. He followed the smell past the quiet houses of Ridgeway. The streets were empty. Everything was still. The trail led him to an old warehouse area. The buildings stood tall and silent. Their windows were broken, and their doors were rusty. No one came here at night. Storm's ears moved. He heard soft sounds, footsteps, whispers, and a car engine in the distance. He stayed low, creeping forward. Mason had trained him well. He knew how to be quiet. He sniffed the air again. Then he saw something. A cell phone lay on the ground near the warehouse door. Storm sniffed it. The smell was familiar. Mason had touched this phone. The screen was broken, and it did not turn on, but it was a clue. Mason had been here. Storm picked up another smell. It was sharp and bitter, gun oil. Someone had cleaned a gun here. That meant danger was close. Storm stepped forward, but then he heard a sound. A creak. A shuffle. Someone was near. He hid behind a pile of wooden crates, his ears alert. A man walked out from the dark, holding a rifle. He wore dark clothes, and his hood covered his face. He looked around, checking the area. Storm did not move. He had to wait. He had learned patience from Mason. The man took a step closer, then another. Storm got ready. The man reached into his pocket, pulling out a cigarette. He lit it and turned away for just a moment. That was all Storm needed. He jumped. His teeth sank into the man's arm. The man shouted and dropped the rifle. Storm knocked him to the ground, growling deep in his throat. The man fought back, trying to push Storm away, but Storm held on. His grip tightened until the man stopped struggling. He groaned in pain. Storm let go. The man was no longer a danger. Storm sniffed again. He had thought Mason would be inside the warehouse, but something was wrong. The smell led away from the building, toward the trees behind it. The kidnappers had moved Mason again. Storm growled. He was close, but he still had more work to do. Storm moved carefully through the trees. His nose followed Mason's smell. It was stronger now, mixed with sweat and blood. His heart beat fast, but he did not stop. He had followed the trail through the forest, and now he saw the place ahead. A broken old building stood in front of him. The walls were cracked, and vines covered them. Dim lights shone from inside. Storm crouched low. Mason was in there. Storm crept closer. He reached a broken window and looked inside. What he saw made his fur rise. Mason was tied to a chair. His face was bruised. Blood dripped from his lip. Several men stood around him. One man stepped forward. He was tall with slick back hair and cold eyes. Storm knew him. Luis Ortega. Ortega leaned down and spoke softly. "Tell me where the files are, Mason. You had them years ago. I want them." Mason lifted his head. His voice was weak but firm. "I don't know what you're talking about." Ortega sighed and nodded. A man stepped forward and punched Mason in the stomach. Mason groaned but said nothing. Ortega stood up. "You have until dawn. If you don't talk, you die." Storm growled softly. He had to act fast. He moved away from the window and circled the building. He needed a way inside. The front was guarded, but the side door was open. He slipped in quietly. His eyes adjusted to the dark. He listened. He smelled. He planned. A guard stood near some crates, holding a rifle. Storm moved slowly. One step, then another. Then he jumped. His teeth sank into the man's wrist. The guard screamed and dropped the rifle. Storm knocked him down. One guard was gone. Storm kept moving. Another man came around the corner. He saw Storm and reached for his gun, but Storm was faster. He bit the man's leg. The man fell, crying out. Storm left him and ran toward the room where Mason was. Gunshots rang out. The noise was loud. The men had heard the fight. Storm hid behind a crate, waiting. He listened. Footsteps ran toward him. A man appeared, aiming a gun. Storm jumped. The man fired, but the shot missed. Storm hit him hard, knocking him back. The gun slid across the floor. Storm grabbed the man's arm and bit down. The man screamed and fell. Storm did not stop. He had no time to rest. He ran forward, pain burning in his side and leg. His breath was heavy, but he kept going. Mason needed him. He reached the door. He could hear Ortega talking. "Time's almost up, Mason. One last chance. Where are the files?" Mason said nothing. Storm did not wait. He charged in. The men turned in surprise. Before they could react, Storm attacked. He jumped at the nearest man, knocking him into the wall. Another man grabbed his gun, but Storm bit his hand. The gun fell to the floor. Ortega cursed. "Kill that dog." One man tried to kick Storm, but Storm dodged and bit his leg. The man fell, screaming. Storm turned toward Ortega, growling. Ortega stepped back. His eyes narrowed. "I should have killed that dog years ago." Then he ran. Storm wanted to chase him, but Mason was more important. He ran to Mason's side and barked. Mason opened his eyes. "Storm, you found me." Storm tugged at the ropes on Mason's hands. Mason groaned and tried to move. I can't stand." Storm whined and licked Mason's hand. He had to get him out. Ortega ran through the dark warehouse, breathing hard. He had made a mistake. He thought Storm was just an old dog, too weak to fight. But he was wrong. Storm was strong. He was smart, and he would not stop. Ortega hid behind a stack of crates, holding his gun tight. His men were still fighting, but he knew the real problem was Storm. That dog had already defeated many guards. Ortega needed to end this now. He grabbed his radio. "Kill the dog. Now." Storm stayed beside Mason for a moment. He licked Mason's hand, then turned toward the door. He heard the voices outside. More men were coming. Mason, weak but aware, saw Storm's eyes. "Storm, be careful." Storm moved through the warehouse, slow and quiet. His ears twitched, listening for danger. He heard footsteps. He heard the click of a gun. He stayed low, creeping behind a metal shelf. The air smelled like sweat and gun oil. A guard stepped forward, holding a rifle. Storm attacked before the man could shoot. His teeth sank into the man's arm, making him drop the gun. The man screamed as Storm knocked him to the ground. Another guard turned the corner and fired. The bullet cut across Storm's shoulder, burning his skin, but he didn't stop. He jumped again, taking down the second man. Mason, still tied to the chair, struggled with the ropes. He felt along the edge of the chair, searching for something sharp. His fingers found a nail sticking out of the wood. Slowly, he rubbed the rope against it, back and forth. Ortega saw Mason moving. He raised his gun. "You're out of time." Before he could shoot, Storm leaped. He crashed into Ortega, making him miss. Ortega fired again. The bullet hit Storm's side. Storm yelped, but he did not stop. He bit into Ortega's wrist, forcing the gun away. Mason felt the ropes loosen. He pulled hard, and his hands were free. He reached for the fallen guard's rifle. His arms were weak, but he lifted it. "Drop it, Ortega." Ortega kicked Storm away and tried to run, but Mason fired. The bullet hit Ortega's leg, and he fell. Before he could get up, Storm was on him again, holding him down. Outside, sirens screamed. The police had arrived. The last of Ortega's men tried to run, but officers rushed in. One by one, they were caught and handcuffed. It was over. Mason leaned back, breathing hard. Storm limped toward him. His fur was wet with blood. Mason reached out and stroked his head. "You did it, boy. You saved me." Storm wagged his tail just a little. He had finished his mission. Paramedics came in with stretchers. They lifted Mason up. A medic kneeled beside Storm, checking his wounds. "This dog is a hero," he said. Mason smiled. He always was. Storm closed his eyes. He could rest now. He had fought his hardest fight, and he had won. Mason knelt beside Storm, his hands shaking as he cradled the dog's head. Storm's fur was damp with blood, his breathing slow but steady. Mason pressed his forehead against Storm's, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're still with me, boy. Just hold on." The paramedics rushed in, carefully placing Mason on a stretcher. One of them kneeled beside Storm, checking his wounds. "He's hurt bad, but he's a fighter. We'll do everything we can." Mason nodded, his chest tight with emotion. He watched as they lifted Storm onto his second stretcher. The dog didn't move much, but his eyes stayed on Mason, never looking away. Even now, Storm wanted to protect him. Meanwhile, the police surrounded Ortega, forcing him to the ground. An officer snapped handcuffs around his wrists. "Luis Ortega, you're under arrest. You're done." Ortega glared at Mason as he was dragged away. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Mason, exhausted but firm, met his gaze. "It is." As the sirens faded and the chaos settled, Mason lay on the stretcher, staring at the night sky. He had spent years chasing criminals, stopping men like Ortega. Tonight, it had almost cost him everything. But he wasn't alone. He never had been. Storm had been with him every step of the way. Days passed. Mason woke up in a hospital bed, his body sore but healing. The first thing he asked about was Storm. He made it, the doctor told him. It was close, but he pulled through. Relief washed over Mason. He demanded to see Storm, and when they finally brought him in, Mason felt his throat tighten. Storm was wrapped in bandages, but his eyes were bright. His tail wagged weakly. Mason chuckled. "You never quit, do you?" Storm let out a small huff, as if to say, "Never." Over the next few weeks, they healed together. Mason walked with a cane, and Storm moved slower than before, but they didn't stop. They sat outside in the fresh air, side by side, like they always had. Mason thought about everything they had been through. He had spent his life serving justice, and Storm had been his partner in every way. But he knew their time in the field was over. Storm had given everything he had, and Mason wouldn't ask for more. Instead, Mason made a decision. He visited the police academy, watching the young officers train with their canine partners. He saw eager dogs, ready to learn, and handlers who needed guidance. "You're going to help me train the next generation," Mason said, looking down at Storm. "They need to learn from the best." Storm wagged his tail. He might not chase criminals anymore, but he still had a purpose. The sun rose over the town one quiet morning. Mason and Storm sat on the porch, watching the golden light spread across the sky. The world was peaceful again. Mason placed a hand on Storm's back. "We did good, didn't we?" Storm let out a soft sigh and leaned against him. Two warriors side by side. Their fight was over, but their bond would never break.